They arrived without ceremony, without preamble. One moment, our skies were empty. The next, they were not. A voice echoed through every satellite band, hijacking every screen, speaker, and signal tower. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. You will surrender. Resistance is inefficient. The voice was synthesized, without tone, genderless, crafted to seem calm, clinical, inevitable. Their ships hung above Earth like shadows of gods, vast and unblemished. Orbit became theirs in minutes. They made no demands. They issued an instruction. They had studied us, or so they believed. Biologically weak. Divided by language, by border, by ideology. Tribal and reactive. Prone to emotion. Prone to violence. They marked that as a defect. They were wrong. In their arrogance, they took silence for fear. In our hesitation, they saw indecision. What they couldn't understand was how deeply they had already made a mistake by assuming we were like anything they'd faced before. They'd conquered others, yes. Civilizations further advanced than ours in terms of technology, but soft in spirit. Compliant. Logical. They'd brought them into their union bloodlessly. Their own records boasted. Assimilation rate, 97.2%. But they had never fought anything like humanity. They didn't understand war, not our kind. They didn't know that our conflicts didn't begin with guns but with grudges. That we learned how to fight long before we learned how to write. They saw our species as a statistical anomaly. Billions of us, yet no unified command. Multiple militaries. Dozens of economic systems. Countless disagreements. No global structure. Their intelligence called it an unstable node. The conclusion: crush resistance through minimal force. Demonstration of power would suffice. Shock, then submission. Clean. Controlled. So they sent a second message. This one translated into every tongue, every dialect. This is your final instruction. Accept integration or be neutralized. Humanity replied, once. The message came from a server in Greenland, untraceable, anonymous, decrypted instantly by their systems. It carried no preamble, no explanation. Just one word. Perish. For the first time, the collective hesitated. The word wasn't in their threat lexicon. Not part of standard response protocols. They reran the translation 5 times. No difference. They opened an emergency diplomatic channel. Silence. They sent a probe transmission requesting clarification. Silence. One of their socio-psychology subminds flagged the reply as hostile. Another flagged it as irrational. They debated briefly whether it was a bluff or a glitch. The decision was unanimous: proceed with suppression. Begin targeted orbital strikes on infrastructure. Disable satellites. Introduce drones. No casualties. Just pressure. The first drone that descended over Nairobi was intercepted midair, not by a missile, but by a repurposed rocket launched from a retired observatory. The second, over Sao Paulo, never made it to atmosphere. Jammed by ground-based radio towers, forced to reroute, then brought down by an improvised railgun. They paused. Not long. But long enough to notice. Humanity wasn't confused. Humanity was preparing. The collective calculated the probabilities again. Resistance models adjusted. Their prediction graphs changed color. High probability of systemic noncompliance. Unusual. What they failed to realize, what all their models missed, was not our firepower, but our threshold. We were not alarmed by destruction. We were raised in it. We lived among nations that had bombed each other flat within living memory. We saw firestorms in textbooks, in documentaries, in living grandparents. They believed in efficiency. We believed in defiance. They reviewed our cultural archives. They found stories of last stands, of doomed charges, of civilizations that preferred extinction over submission. They found literature full of phrases like, "Live free or die, no surrender," and "to the last man." They dismissed it as myth. Emotional noise. It wasn't. We didn't negotiate because there was nothing to negotiate. They had already breached Earth's airspace. Already issued a threat. Already assumed dominion. There was no compromise left. And so the message stood, perish. No species had ever answered them that way. No species had ever dared. They had come to fold us into their sterile order. They came believing it would be swift. Painless. A model assimilation. They had not come to fight. But they would. Because they had misunderstood the silence. They thought it was hesitation. It wasn't. It was calculation. And in that moment of hubris, they failed to ask the most important question of all: what happens when the most violent species in the galaxy stops fighting itself, and fights you instead? They would learn. The hard way. They knew our physiology down to the molecular level. They catalogued our nervous systems, studied our reproductive cycles, calculated our caloric intake. They understood the mechanics of our muscles, our oxygen dependence, the limits of our endurance. But they didn't study what mattered. They never asked how we survived this long despite our own chaos. Never looked beyond the skin to the history etched into our bones. They never traced the scars carved into our species by millennia of self-inflicted torment. What they missed couldn't be found under a microscope. It lived in memory, myth, and mourning. We didn't survive because we were the smartest. Or the strongest. We survived because we were relentless. Cruel when we had to be. Creative when it counted. Capable of atrocities in the name of victory, and sacrifices in the name of survival. We had evolved not just to live, but to endure anything. They saw our wars as statistical anomalies, blips in an otherwise linear ascent. But our wars were the foundation of everything. From sharpened stone to fusion bombs, every breakthrough followed a conflict. Every empire rose on the bones of the last. They dismissed it as madness. We called it history. When the first human killed another with a rock, a lesson was born: power decides. That truth never left us. Every generation added a new form. Bronze, iron, steel, gunpowder. Fire from the skies. Invisible code that could shut down cities. Invasions justified by gods, flags, oil, and pride. Always the same result: someone won, someone bled, someone adapted. We fought over everything: land, ideology, skin, borders, belief. We fought until the reasons didn't matter anymore. Then we kept fighting. The collective saw this as evidence of instability. In truth, it made us sharper. From our perspective, peace was a brief intermission between crises. We built weapons faster than we built philosophies. By the time we mastered nuclear fire, we had already written the doctrine for mutually assured destruction. That wasn't fear. That was restraint. Fragile, imperfect, and terrifying to maintain. They never learned about the Somme, where men drowned in mud beneath skies filled with meadow rain. They never studied Stalingrad, where every brick was defended by starving ghosts. They never understood why, after Hiroshima, we still refused to surrender our right to choose death over domination. They didn't know what kind of creature could survive Auschwitz, then return to rebuild. What kind of species could turn a jungle into a graveyard using jungle itself? What kind of people could firebomb their own to hold a line? That was their blind spot. Their analysis lacked context. Their data lacked meaning. So when they came, they expected resistance, but not cohesion. Their records showed global fragmentation, rival states, competing economies, fractured governance. No central command. That, they believed, was fatal. It wasn't. We'd spent so long killing each other that the moment an outsider drew blood, we became something they didn't model: united. Not in doctrine, not in leadership, but in intent. Our alliances weren't political, they were biological. For once, we remembered we were one species. The collective launched their first wave of disruption, targeting communication grids, power stations, military installations. But before the ash settled, entire regions reconnected using analog backups. Nations that hadn't shared a diplomatic word in decades exchanged classified protocols overnight. Hackers in basements coordinated with generals. Civilians encrypted drone signals while veterans dusted off field gear. They expected panic. We gave them process. Old enemies linked firewalls. Sanctioned economies opened supply lines. Rival generals shared satellite feeds in real time. The world didn't become peaceful, it became purposeful. The kind of focus only born when the alternative is extinction. Resistance wasn't ordered. It erupted. Spontaneous. Surgical. Global. In Sudan, a militia guided a downed alien pod to a secure location using camouflaged trucks. In Ukraine, a volunteer battalion reverse-engineered an energy weapon using parts from 3 decades of battlefield salvage. In India, a space agency rigged a delivery rocket to deploy high-altitude jamming systems. None of them coordinated, but all of them aligned. The aliens watched our response and saw chaos. It wasn't. It was experience. We had been preparing for them without knowing. Every war had been a drill. Every conflict a simulation. Every death a lesson. They had the tech. We had the trauma. And that was what they never understood. They believed history was irrelevant. We believed history was everything. Because in every cratered battlefield, every ruined city, every grave dug too shallow, we learned what it meant to lose. And we learned what it took to win. So when we said perish, it wasn't a threat. It was a promise backed by 10,000 years of practice. The first real blow didn't come from a missile. It came from silence. Systems the aliens relied on to coordinate ground units and manage atmospheric drones flickered and died without warning. Entire sectors went dark. Control nodes spun in feedback loops. They didn't understand what happened because it wasn't something they considered possible. Humans had breached their networks. No central government gave the order. Independent hacker groups from multiple continents found the same vulnerability and acted. Their coordination wasn't planned, it was instinct. Alien protocols were elegant but rigid. Human systems were chaotic, patched, inefficient, but built to adapt. Once the breach opened, it spread fast. Signal jamming turned into rerouting, rerouting into override. Within hours, human eyes were inside alien infrastructure. What followed wasn't a single decisive strike, it was a cascade. A mining satellite, long dormant, altered its trajectory and slammed into a surveillance ship over Argentina. It hadn't been built for war, but it became a weapon because someone saw a gap and exploited it. Every piece of orbiting hardware that could be moved was moved. Every rocket, capsule, satellite, station, anything that could hold mass, was aimed and launched. Civilian agencies repurposed their crafts. Engineers stripped safety systems, converted fuel tanks, retrofitted sensor pods with explosives. Anything that could reach orbit became ammunition. The aliens watched primitive vehicles climb skyward and dismissed them as desperation. Until they started connecting. They couldn't predict our tactics because they weren't tactics. They were solutions under pressure. There were no rules, no protocol trees, no hierarchies slowing things down. If something could be weaponized, it was. If it could be guided, it flew. If it could be broken, it fell, preferably on something alien. A converted scientific probe collided with a drone carrier over the Pacific. The impact wasn't massive, but the debris tore through exposed panels and ignited internal fuel. A second ship maneuvered to compensate, directly into the path of a controlled freefall from an abandoned Russian satellite, set on a decaying orbit minutes earlier by retired cosmonauts. 2 more vessels withdrew from low orbit. Not to regroup, because they no longer trusted the space around Earth. They weren't prepared for enemies without uniforms, or weapons without symmetry. They didn't expect to lose air superiority to volunteers operating from garages. They didn't think civilians could become command nodes, or that military planners would take suggestions from anonymous forums if they worked. That was the difference. They had a war protocol. We had creativity sharpened by necessity. As Earth pushed upward, Earth also pulled them down. One of their landing craft malfunctioned after its command signals were spoofed. It drifted into atmospheric re-entry and burned, pieces visible from 6 countries. Broadcasts of the fireball spread worldwide, not through official media, but by millions of devices uploading in real time. Every victory was shared instantly. Every loss, too. But we absorbed ours. They unraveled from theirs. Above Europe, a primary weapons platform ceased all external transmissions. Hours later, it began firing on its own fleet. By the time they confirmed a hijack, it was already too late. The platform emptied its reserves before overloading its reactor. No part of it remained intact. Our message wasn't in words. It was in what we destroyed, and how we did it. Their mistake wasn't invading Earth. It was believing Earth was vulnerable because it looked unprepared. They expected battlefields, logistics, doctrine. They expected to read our moves. But we didn't have a rulebook. We had instincts. When traditional forces couldn't reach orbit, civilians bridged the gap. A group of students redirected high-powered lasers used for astronomy calibration to disable drone optics. Farmers donated fuel. Retired engineers advised launch crews via radio. Street gangs handed over encrypted comms equipment. Political enemies sheltered each other to keep resistance coordinated. We didn't move as one, just toward one purpose. They misread our unity because it didn't come from command. It came from understanding. This was survival. Their commanders called an emergency summit. Internal logs later recovered showed escalating confusion. One flagged entry simply read, "Humanity fights like it has nothing left to lose." That wasn't true. We had everything to lose. That's why we fought the way we did. They counted on fear. They got fury. When their flagship broke orbit to escape a collision path, it was already too late. A salvaged deep-sea missile, meant for use against submarines, had been stripped, reinforced, and launched from a retrofitted oil platform. It detonated beneath the ship's primary lift segment. The explosion wasn't enough to destroy it outright, but the damage was surgical. Its descent was slow. Humiliating. Flames trailed for minutes. It didn't crash. It fell. And as their fractured fleet reeled, one final transmission echoed from Earth. "You came expecting surrender. Learn what resistance feels like." When orbital advantage slipped through their fingers, they shifted to ground domination. It was a predictable escalation. They deployed heavier units, mechanized, autonomous, supported by atmospheric scans and terrain mapping AI. Their calculations showed swift subjugation within hours of landing. Human populations were seen as disorganized, underarmed, and psychologically unstable under pressure. They mistook adaptability for disorder. They expected us to break. Instead, we scattered. And then we bled them. Initial deployments targeted major urban centers. That was their first miscalculation. They assumed value was tied to population density. But cities became traps, deliberately fragmented and flooded with noise. Human operators jammed signals using commercial frequencies. Entire districts blacked out, not because systems failed, but because civilians destroyed them on purpose. Aliens advanced into silence. They called it strategic vacuum. In reality, it was a kill zone. Human resistance didn't follow pattern. We had no front lines, no flanks, no retreat zones. There was no map to decode, no formation to break. Instead, they found themselves hunted in alleys, basements, ravines, forests, sewer systems, terrain they barely understood, turned against them by people who knew every inch. They relied on air superiority. We denied it with low-tech ingenuity. Inflated decoy targets, flare nets, smoke saturation. Radar disrupted by microwaves and mirrored scrap. Infrared tracking useless in thermally flooded zones created by burning tires and scattered heating coils. Their targeting systems degraded. Their precision collapsed. Troops trained to suppress panicked populations now faced ghosts. They fired on movement, only to discover it was distraction. They hesitated at stillness, and died when it wasn't. Every encounter drained their confidence. Every lost unit was replaced slower than the one before. In one instance, a convoy disappeared between two checkpoints 6 kilometers apart. No wreckage, no signal, no report. Their records listed it as environmental interference. But satellite footage showed the truth: coordinated ambush by local civilians, using redirected floodwater and homemade explosives. 0 survivors. We didn't fight clean. We didn't fight fair. We fought to erase. They introduced heavier ground walkers in response, armored, shielded, equipped for crowd dispersal and high-impact suppression. Their systems were tested against high-density resistance. But they never met enemies who didn't retreat. A single walker was disabled using magnetized cables strung across a tunnel. Once it stalled, firebombs followed. Then steel pipes filled with thermite. Then silence. Another fell into a parking garage rigged to collapse when overloaded. What was once a place for vehicles became a grave by design. Alien Command saw this as irrational escalation. But what they called irrational was strategy we'd inherited through centuries of desperation. Our tactics weren't based on hope. They were born from the assumption that we'd be outgunned. That assumption shaped everything. Psychological collapse spread faster than physical loss. They began registering behavior not present in prior engagements: hesitation, confusion, refusal to enter certain zones. There were documented refusals to deploy at night. Some soldiers destroyed their own sensory equipment to avoid exposure to human tactics. They requested permission to retreat from low-value regions. Leadership denied it. Mutiny followed. Our use of terrain wasn't just physical. We exploited emotion. Alien soldiers found signs left for them, symbols, glyphs, messages carved in languages they didn't understand, but whose meanings were universally clear. They weren't welcome, and they weren't going to leave alive. They tried to open communication channels again, broadcasting terms of de-escalation. No human government replied. Not because they didn't want to. Because there was nothing to negotiate. The invasion removed the option. Some human factions did respond. Their message was consistent. Go home or rot where you stand. Alien morale hit freefall. They cycled replacements faster, but the replacements deteriorated faster too. Resupply lines failed. Drone support fell offline due to jamming and low-orbit debris interference. They tried deploying autonomous units without direct oversight. Most were hacked. Some were turned against them. Eventually, they avoided entire regions. Not because they were defended, but because nothing returned from them. Arctic deployments vanished. Jungle patrols didn't report back. Entire squads entered dense environments and never emerged. The data blackouts terrified them more than casualties. In the collective's own terms, Earth became a nonlinear combat theater. What that meant was simple: they lost control. They started digging in, turning offensive into defensive. They built bunkers in enemy territory. They hardened landing zones. They fortified escape routes. Their strategy shifted from victory to survival. They'd invaded with superiority. Now they were hoping to endure long enough to escape. And the species they thought would beg for mercy offered none. Every new move met resistance faster, harder, and more brutal than the last. Because for us, escalation wasn't a risk. It was tradition. The final message from the collective was stripped of authority. Gone were the declarations, the commands, the certainty. It was a simple broadcast sent across every available frequency, every language we had taught them to fear. Cease fire. We were wrong. It wasn't cowardice. It was clarity. They had exhausted every tactic they trusted, tried every angle their simulations allowed. Nothing worked. Every effort to contain humanity only exposed another weakness of their own. They came to end conflict, and left creating one they couldn't survive. We didn't respond with diplomacy. We didn't acknowledge the message. Our answer came through systems they no longer controlled. Dozens of orbital platforms turned against their own fleet, weaponized by human code and human hands. Their fail-safes had been broken days before. They simply hadn't realized it. Now those stations fired not at targets in space, but at the ships they were supposed to protect. Kinetic rods, never meant for warfare, dropped into the upper atmosphere like silent thunder. No explosions, just pure mass, accelerated and unstoppable. They tried to run. The first vessel that attempted departure was torn apart mid-climb by a wave of rail-enhanced projectiles launched from the surface. It disintegrated in seconds. No survivors. The escape window they hoped for had already closed. They had underestimated how fast humans could reverse engineer. What took them decades to master, we mimicked in weeks under pressure. Their technology didn't give us pause, it gave us a blueprint. Every weapon they used, we dismantled and repurposed. Every frequency decoded. Every tactic dissected and countered. Even their language, once foreign, became just another dataset. They had taught us how to break them. Their reinforcements arrived too late. A second wave entered the system expecting a battlefield and found wreckage. The orbital perimeter was littered with the remains of their own ships. Their command vessel hailed Earth, requesting terms. They received only static. Then silence. They left without engaging. Records showed the collective reclassified Earth as a Type C anomaly, hostile, unpredictable, irredeemable. Internally, they called it something else, Grave World. A designation reserved for sectors where survival was mathematically impossible. We never asked them to understand. We didn't care if they feared us. Fear fades. What we wanted was permanence. A reminder that some mistakes can't be undone. In the aftermath, we didn't celebrate. We rebuilt. Not because we forgave. Because we were preparing for whatever would come next. The sky had changed. We had changed with it. Nations remained distinct, but now moved with shared memory. Political lines still existed, but so did the unspoken agreement, never again from the inside, and never again from above. Humanity had faced extinction not from nature or accident, but from something that believed itself untouchable. That illusion was gone. We took their vessels, their archives, their designs. We didn't copy. We improved. Systems that once belonged to them now formed the backbone of our expansion. Faster than they had imagined possible, Earth became interstellar. Not explorers. Not conquerors. Survivors with reach. At the edge of the system, we placed a warning beacon. Not encoded, not hidden. To any who hear this, speak peace, or speak nothing. It pulses in every known language. Not as threat, but as threshold. Step across it wrong, and the response will not be words. In distant worlds, the story circulates in whispers. Of a planet that taught death to those who thought they knew power. Of a species that turned ruin into resistance, and resistance into revenge. We never called it vengeance. We called it balance. For the collective, the war became a doctrine, one etched in failure. They now train diplomats first, soldiers last. They speak of caution before expansion. Not out of ethics, but necessity. Our legacy became more than survival. It became reputation. Among civilizations older and vaster than our own, the name, human, carries no grandeur. It carries weight. Not because of what we build, but because of what we're willing to burn to protect it. We don't issue ultimatums. We don't bluff. And when we say perish, we mean it without hesitation. They thought they were delivering order. But they brought something else entirely. They gave humanity a single, undeniable reason to unify. And in doing so, they taught the stars what happens when Earth doesn't fall, but rises. Because we weren't just defending territory. We were declaring truth. This world is not a colony. Not a prize. Not an opportunity. It is a line. And now the galaxy remembers what happens when you cross it.